There is a record, buried inside the Galactic Council's restricted archive, Tier Obsidian, which means even most council members don't know it exists, labeled simply, Resolution 7 VETH, the Human Containment Solution. The timestamp reads 2.3 galactic cycles ago. The vote was unanimous. 47 species. Not one dissent. They looked at humanity young, loud, bleeding from a dozen self-inflicted wounds, barely spacefaring, already arguing about who owned the spacefaring, and the council made what they believed was the single most merciful, most logical, most civilized decision in their long institutional history. They drew a line around the Sol system. They called it a quarantine zone. Publicly. Officially. With the kind of careful language that bureaucracies use when they don't want the word exile to appear on the record. Then, they waited for the problem to solve itself. I was a junior signal analyst on the monitoring station assigned to watch the quarantine border. Routine post. Quiet sector. The kind of assignment that got handed to officers whose careers weren't going anywhere and who weren't expected to make anything happen. I logged 14 months of nothing. No human vessel crossed the boundary line. No human signal escaped the dampening net. The council filed its quarterly reports. Containment holding. No anomalies. Proceed with standard protocol. Then, on what my log records as a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, which is a human unit of time I had started using ironically and, then, somehow, hadn't stopped, the long-range array screamed every alarm it had simultaneously. Not one ship. Not a fleet. Something larger. Something that had not been built. Something that had been grown. I remember staring at the readout for 11 seconds before I filed my report. I know it was 11 seconds because I timestamp everything. It's a nervous habit my supervisor called pathological and I called prudent, and we had never resolved that disagreement. I filed the report. Then, I sat back in my chair, and I looked at the readings, and I said out loud, to no one, in a monitoring station I shared only with 2 broken atmospheric scrubbers and a coffee dispenser that had been producing something chemically adjacent to coffee for the last 6 months. Oh. They were never trying to leave. This is what the council got wrong. They thought exile was a punishment. Humanity treated it like a starting pistol. What follows is my personal log, cross-referenced with classified after-action reports, intercepted human communications, and 3 separate council emergency sessions that were never made public, covering the 14 months between Resolution 7 VETH and what the council now, very quietly, refers to as the First Contact Correction. I have been advised, by 2 lawyers and 1 intelligence officer, not to publish this. I am publishing it anyway. I have timestamps. The station smells like recycled ozone and whatever the atmospheric processors do when they're working at 70% capacity, which is their default setting because no one in the requisitions chain has approved the maintenance budget in 3 fiscal cycles. I mention this not because it's relevant but because when you spend 14 months alone with a malfunctioning coffee dispenser and a long-range sensor array, the smell of things becomes the texture of time. Day 1. Clean slate. New assignment. I had read the council briefing on humanity twice on the transit flight over. Dense document. Full of words like risk mitigation and developmental ceiling and inevitable trajectory modeling, which is the kind of language the council uses when it has decided something is going to happen and wants to make sure the records show it wasn't a decision so much as a conclusion. The conclusion was this: humanity was going to collapse. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But, the modeling run by 6 independent xenosociological institutes across 4 star systems projected that without access to galactic trade, galactic medicine, galactic infrastructure, humanity's internal fractures would deepen until they became structural failures. Wars over resources they could no longer import. Political collapses they could no longer stabilize with outside investment. A civilization that had never quite figured out how to be one thing would finally, under sufficient pressure, stop trying. The council was not doing this out of malice. I want to be clear about that, because what comes later tends to make people read malice backward into the early decisions, and that's not accurate. The council genuinely believed that a humanity contained was a humanity preserved. Kept from spreading. Kept from making contact with species it might destabilize. Kept from acquiring technology it might weaponize. The word exile never appeared in the official documentation. The phrase used was directed developmental pause. I had written exile in my personal shorthand the moment I read it, and I had felt only mildly guilty about that. Cycle 2.3.001 Day 1, Hour 9, my first full sensor sweep came back clean. The dampening net was functioning at spec. The boundary markers were holding position. Long range showed the Sol system sitting quietly inside its quarantine perimeter, the human signals bouncing internally against the net's interference field, going nowhere. I logged it. Status nominal. No anomalies. I made myself what the dispenser insisted was coffee. It tasted like the memory of something that had once been near coffee. I drank it anyway. Cycle 2.3.014, Day 14. The thing about monitoring a quarantine perimeter is that it sounds more active than it is. I am not patrolling. I am watching. The difference, in practice, is that patrolling involves movement and watching involves sitting in the same chair until the chair begins to feel like a physical extension of your body, which mine did by Day 9. Day 14 I logged 6 routine sweeps. All nominal. I had started talking to the atmospheric scrubbers. Not conversation. More like narration. A habit I developed in long solo postings. My supervisor on my previous assignment had described it as a coping mechanism that raises no safety concerns but perhaps warrants discussion, and I had agreed to discuss it and, then, not discussed it. The scrubbers didn't have opinions about the Council's humanity policy. I found this refreshing. Cycle 2.3.031, Day 31, something made me pull a deep spectrum passive scan on the Sol system's inner signal field. No operational reason. The official monitoring protocol was surface-level active pings, which were enough to confirm the net was holding. The deep spectrum passive scan was the kind of thing you did when you were bored and curious and slightly worried that Nominal was doing a lot of work. The results were interesting. Not alarming. Not yet. But interesting. Human signal traffic had increased since the quarantine began. Internal comms. Tight beam. Short range, all of it contained well within the dampening net, none of it going anywhere. But the volume was up. Significantly. The pattern looked less like a civilization deteriorating into silence and more like I sat with it for a while. It looked like a civilization that had stopped talking outward and started talking to itself. Intensely. Constantly. Like a room full of people who'd been told to be quiet and responded by moving closer together and lowering their voices. I flagged it in my log. Signal traffic increase, internal only, no boundary breach, no operational concern. Then, I sat with the read for another few minutes. No operational concern was also doing a lot of work. Cycle 2.3.060, Day 60, the Council Quarterly Report was filed. I contributed 3 paragraphs. Containment nominal. No boundary crossings. No anomalies detected. Standard language. Accurate language. The kind of language that looks, in retrospect, like a man standing in a burning building filing a report that says temperature above average. It wasn't that I was hiding anything. Nothing I had observed constituted a breach of the quarantine parameters. The net held. The humans stayed inside. They were just very, very busy inside it. I had started running passive analysis on the signal patterns as a personal project entirely outside my official protocols, entirely on my own cycles, fueled by the coffee-adjacent substance and a feeling I couldn't quite name but that felt like the space between interesting and worried. The signal traffic had organized. That was the word I kept arriving at. Organized. Not random chatter. Not the scattered noise of a civilization arguing with itself. There were rhythms to it now. Call and response patterns. Geographic clustering, which meant the signals were originating from specific coordinated locations across the planet's surface and, also, which I had to run the analysis 3 times to confirm, from off-surface. Human orbital infrastructure. which they had, in limited form. Low tech. Their own stations, their own platforms, pre-existing the quarantine. The Council had factored this in. Contained systems. No jump capability. But, the signals between the orbital platforms and the surface had tripled in the last 60 days. I filed a note in my personal log, not the official one. They are not mourning. They are meeting. Cycle 2.3.090, Day 90. The first time I saw the name Yara Vasquez, it was in an intercepted fragment of human tactical communication that had bounced sideways off a dampening net relay and landed in my secondary monitoring buffer. The fragment was partial. Compressed. Encrypted in a human cipher that the Council's decryption tools took 11 hours to unravel, which, and I logged this timestamp because it felt relevant, was 11 hours faster than the Council's documentation claimed human encryption of that type should take to crack. The cipher had been modified. Upgraded, post-quarantine. The decrypted fragment was 14 words. Vasquez confirms Phase 2. Orbital relay network at 73%. Proceed with groundside assembly. I read it 4 times. Then, I pulled every prior intercept from the last 90 days and ran a keyword correlation for Phase 2. I got 43 hits. 43 separate communications, spanning multiple geographic locations, multiple languages. The translator flagged 7 distinct ones, all referencing Phase 2 as a coordinated next stage of something that had a Phase 1 and, presumably, a Phase 3. I had not flagged Phase 1 because I had not known to look for it. I sat in my chair in the ozone-scented monitoring station and understood, with the particular clarity that comes from feeling very stupid about something you should have caught sooner, that I had spent 90 days watching a locked door while the occupants quietly built a second building. I filed an official flag. First one of the posting. Coordinated Internal Activity Phase reference detected possible organized development program, recommend expanded monitoring protocol. The Council acknowledged receipt in 48 hours. Their response was 2 sentences, current monitoring parameters deemed sufficient. Maintain standard protocol. I logged the timestamp of that response. Obviously. Cycle 2.3.120, Day 120. The thing about Yara Vasquez, and I say this as someone who, at this point, had assembled a fairly comprehensive profile on her from intercepted fragments, publicly available pre-quarantine human media archives, and the kind of obsessive secondary research that is either a professional asset or a diagnosable condition depending on who you ask, is that she was not supposed to be the one doing this. The Council's threat modeling, when it had done threat modeling at all, had focused on human governmental structures. Nation-states. Military hierarchies. The big, visible, formal things. If humanity was going to resist the quarantine, the model said it would come from those structures. Loud. Confrontational. Detectable. Vasquez was a materials engineer. Pre-quarantine, she had worked in asteroid mining operations. Practical woman. Her public record was almost comically mundane: patents for extraction tool modifications, 3 published papers on low-gravity alloy behavior, 1 disciplinary note from an employer about unauthorized modifications to company equipment. That last one, in retrospect, was the tell. She had looked at the quarantine the way she apparently looked at company equipment, as a set of existing parameters that were inadequate for the actual job, and, therefore subject to unauthorized modification. The Phase 2 relay network was hers. I was almost certain. The engineering signature, the way the orbital platforms had been quietly, incrementally repurposed, systems running slightly outside their documented specs in ways that wouldn't trigger automated alerts, changes small enough individually to look like drift end, then, suddenly, function that was the same signature as the asteroid tool patents. She was not building a weapon. She was building reach. Cycle 2.3.150, Day 150, I submitted a second flag. More detailed this time. I had spent a month assembling the picture and I gave the Council all of it: the signal patterns, the Phase 2 references, the relay network analysis, the Vasquez profile, the encryption upgrade timeline, the cross-reference geographic clustering that showed coordinated activity across 6 continents and, for orbital platforms. I gave them 47 pages. Their response was 1 paragraph. Analyst Vensora, your monitoring data confirms containment integrity. Internal organizational activity is expected and does not constitute a quarantine breach. Continued surveillance within standard parameters is both sufficient and appropriate. Expand documentation if boundary stress detected. I read the paragraph 3 times. Then, I went to the dispenser and got my coffee-adjacent substance. I drank it standing up, which I never do, looking at the long-range display showing the Sol system sitting inside its neat perimeter, all its signals bouncing internally, nothing crossing the line. The Council wasn't wrong, technically. The containment was holding. Nothing had crossed the boundary. They had looked at the locked door and confirmed it was still locked. They had not asked what was being built on the other side. I went back to my console and opened a new file in my personal log, not the official monitoring record, my personal one, the one I kept in a partition no one else accessed. I labeled it, "What I Think is Happening." I wrote for 3 hours. By the end of it I had a theory that I believed was correct and that I had no official standing to act on and that, if I was right, meant the Council had approximately 8 to 14 months before their very careful, very logical, very civilized solution became a case study in the specific catastrophe of assuming a problem will solve itself if you stop looking at it directly. I timestamped the file. I went to sleep. The scrubbers hummed. The door stayed locked. For now. I need to talk about the coffee. I know that is not where my professional log should begin. I know that. The coffee is not operationally relevant. But I have been alone on this station for 6 months and the dispenser has progressively worsened its output. The substance it currently produces sits in the cup at an angle, which should not be physically possible for a liquid, and it has a smell I can only describe as aggressive, and I mention it because the first thing Yara Vesquez apparently said in the intercepted Phase 3 briefing, which I received this morning and have been sitting with for 4 hours, was, "We are going to need better coffee once we're out." This was recorded laughter. I have been thinking about that laughter for 4 hours. Specifically about the once, not if. The casualness of once. The way it landed in the recording, not like a hope or a dream or even a plan, but like a given. A matter of scheduling. I need to explain what the Phase 3 briefing contained. But first I need to explain what I now understand about Phase 1, which I missed entirely, and Phase 2, which I caught the tail end of and misread. Reconstructed timeline, compiled from intercepted fragments and personal analysis. Phase 1 had begun inside the first 30 days of the quarantine. I know this because I went back and pulled every signal fragment I had passively logged and ignored in the first month, the low-priority background noise I had treated as static, and I ran the Vasquez engineering signature against it. 51 hits. 51 communications that I had categorized as ambient chatter, internal civilian noise, expected organizational activity. Phase 1 was not a protest. It was not political organizing. It was not the loud, confrontational response the Council's threat modeling had predicted. Phase 1 was an inventory. Systematic. Comprehensive. Run across every human nation, every research institution, every military structure, every private organization with relevant assets. What do we have? What can it do? What is it rated for and what is it actually capable of at its operational limit? They had cataloged themselves. Everything. Industrial capacity, scientific personnel, existing orbital infrastructure, raw materials accessible within the quarantine perimeter, fuel stockpiles, communication hardware. A full ledger of a civilization's total resources, assembled in 30 days, shared across 6 continents and, for orbital platforms, compiled into something they were apparently calling, I found the phrase in 7 separate fragments, the actual number. Not the number that appeared in their governmental records. Not the number they reported to international bodies. The actual number. The distinction, which took me an embarrassingly long time to understand, was this: humanity had spent generations understating its own capabilities. To each other. To potential adversaries. To anyone watching. The official figures were comfortable fictions maintained by governments that wanted leverage and corporations that wanted room to maneuver. The actual number was what happened when everyone agreed, under the particular pressure of having nothing to lose by honesty, to simply tell the truth about what they had. The actual number was larger than the Council's models. Significantly. I do not mean this as drama. I mean it as a data failure. The Council had modeled humanity's developmental ceiling based on its reported infrastructure. The reported infrastructure was, on average, 63% of what the actual number showed. They had been watching a shadow and calling it the thing. Cycle 2.3.180, continuing, Phase 2 I had caught partially. The Relay Network. Vasquez's repurposed orbital platforms. What I had understood as reach, and I had been right about that, was specifically reach for a purpose I had not grasped until the Phase 3 briefing decoded this morning. The relay network was not a communication system. Well, it was. But that was secondary. The relay network was a clock. Humanity's pre-quarantine timekeeping was tied to the galactic standard, which passed through infrastructure they no longer had access to. Inside the quarantine, their clocks were drifting, not enough to matter in daily life, but enough to matter enormously if you were trying to coordinate a simultaneous event across 6 continents and, for orbital platforms with precision measured in seconds. Vasquez had built a new clock. A self-contained, internally synchronized, drift-corrected timekeeping network that used the relay platforms as reference nodes and kept every point inside the quarantine perimeter on the same second. She had built it so they could all move at once. I had looked at the relay network and thought, communication infrastructure. It was an ignition system. Cycle 2.3.195, Day 195, the Phase 3 briefing had been delivered to what I estimated, from signal traffic analysis, was approximately 400 recipients in 12 geographic locations. It was encrypted in the modified cipher, still running 11 hours behind the Council's decryption tools, which I had stopped reporting because the Council kept filing it under no operational concern. I spent 11 hours waiting for the decryption to finish. I made 3 cups of the aggressive coffee. I paced, which is technically possible in the monitoring station but requires a very particular shuffle that accounts for the equipment rack in the middle of the floor that has been there since before my posting and that I have bruised my hip on 47 times, which I know because I started counting on day 3. Then, the decryption finished. I read the document. I read it again. I went to the console and I opened a new official monitoring flag, my 3rd, which already put me outside normal protocol for a standard posting, and I typed for 40 minutes. The Phase 3 briefing outlined, in the kind of practical engineering language that Vasquez apparently used for everything including her feelings, a construction project. Distributed. Simultaneous. Running across 11 major orbital and surface sites, coordinated to the relay clock's precision timing, using materials sourced entirely from within the quarantine perimeter and fabricated using techniques that were, I checked this twice, not in any of the Council's records of human technological capability. They had developed them. Post-quarantine. In 8 months. I want to sit with that for a moment because I think it gets lost in what comes after. In 8 months of isolation, with no outside resources, no galactic infrastructure access, under an active dampening net that was specifically designed to limit their technological development, a materials engineer from the asteroid belt and 400 people she had never met in person before the quarantine had developed 3 fabrication techniques the Council did not know existed. The Council's model said isolation would calcify them. The isolation had apparently been clarifying. Cycle 2.3.210, Day 210, I filed my 3rd flag. It was 61 pages. I know because I counted. I had charts. I had the reconstructed Phase 1 timeline. I had the relay clock analysis. I had the Phase 3 fabrication data. I had a projected completion date for whatever was being built at the 11 orbital and surface sites, which my analysis put at approximately 90 to 120 days from the date of the briefing. I had a section titled What I Think They Are Building. I had a second section titled What Happens If I Am Right. I submitted it. Then, I waited. The Council's response took 72 hours. Analyst Vensora, your continued documentation of internal human organizational activity is noted. Current monitoring parameters remain sufficient.
The fabrication techniques you reference are unlikely to represent genuine advancement beyond documented human capability.
Internal coordination, however extensive, does not constitute a quarantine breach.
Standard protocol remains in effect. If boundary stress is detected, escalate immediately. I read the response. I read it again.
I looked at the long-range display.
The quarantine perimeter. The dampening net. Nominal. Intact. The locked door. I thought about the word unlikely.
I thought about unlikely deployed by an institution that had built its entire assessment on documented capability, and the document had been wrong by 63%, and they had not updated the document. I opened my personal log and I wrote one sentence: they are going to be very surprised. Cycle 2.3.260, Day 260, I had started tracking a human named Sergeant Eli Doran because his name appeared in the Phase 3 distribution list and because his background was different from everyone else on it. Vasquez and her 400 were engineers, scientists, logistics specialists. Their communications were full of load tolerances and material grades and fabrication windows. Technical people solving technical problems with the particular economy of people who speak the same language.
Doran's background was not technical.
I pulled his pre-quarantine public record, an infantry sergeant in one of the smaller human military structures.
3 combat deployments.
A medical discharge after the second one, returned to service after the third, which told me something about either his threshold for pain or his attachment to being useful, possibly both. His official record ended 18 months before the quarantine, when his unit was decommissioned in a governmental budget restructuring. His name was on the Phase 3 distribution list as Field Integration Lead, which was a title that had not existed until Phase 3 invented it. I watched his signal traffic the way I watched Vasquez's obsessively, out of protocol, fueled by aggressive coffee, and what I found was that Doran was doing something none of the other Phase 3 personnel were doing.
He was moving. Not metaphorically. Physically.
His signal origin points tracked across multiple geographic locations over the course of the months I was monitoring, a pattern that resolved, when I mapped it, into a circuit.
He was visiting every groundside construction site in sequence. Not inspecting them. The technical oversight was Vasquez's domain and clearly stayed there.
Doran was doing something else at each site. I had 47 intercepted fragments of his communications.
They were short. Clipped. Heavily encrypted.
My decryption tools worked faster on them than on Vasquez's files because he used less sophisticated ciphers, not because he was less careful, I thought, but because he assumed the content would be opaque regardless of the encryption.
Most of his messages were a variation of the same 3 words, addressed to different recipients at different sites. Are you good? Not a question.
The punctuation was absent.
It was a check-in. A hand on a shoulder through a data packet.
From a man who had been in 3 combat deployments and understood, in a way that the engineering briefings didn't have language for, that technically capable people can be technically capable right up until the moment they decide they are alone in the dark. He was making sure they didn't feel alone. I found a fragment from day 240. Doran to a construction team, and what the mapping suggested was Northern Europe. Unencrypted, which was unusual enough that I flagged it for probable intentionality. He had sent it unencrypted on purpose.
They're watching us. Good. Let them watch us work.
I read that fragment at cycle 2.3.260 and I felt something I will describe only as specifically uncomfortable, because I was, in fact, watching.
And he apparently knew.
And he had decided that knowing was not a reason to hide. He had decided that knowing was a reason to perform. Cycle 2.3.290, Day 290, the construction sites were almost done. My analysis put completion at 95% across 10 of the 11 locations. The 11th, a deep orbital platform, the farthest from the surface, was tracking at 81% with a completion projection of 18 to 22 days. I knew what they were building now. I had been right in my third flag. The council had called it unlikely. They were building gates. Not jump gates.
Not the galactic standard infrastructure that required alloys only available on the other side of the quarantine. Something different.
Something that used the fabrication techniques Vasquez's people had developed in isolation, techniques I had spent 3 weeks analyzing and still didn't fully understand because they operated on principles that the Council's physics documentation described as theoretically possible but developmentally inaccessible for a civilization at humanity's stage.
Developmentally inaccessible. Another way of saying we didn't think they could.
The gates, as best I could reconstruct from the engineering fragments, didn't punch through standard space. They did something sideways, through a membrane the human documents called, and the translator had offered 6 options for this phrase and I had chosen the one that felt most accurate, the fold between what is and what insists on being adjacent to it.
Poetic, for engineering documentation.
I had submitted a 4th flag.
89 pages.
The Council acknowledged receipt. Their response was one sentence.
If boundary stress is detected, escalate immediately. I put my head down on the console. I left it there for 6 minutes.
Then, I sat up, and I pulled the long-range array to full resolution, and I looked at the 11 construction sites, and I thought about Doran's unencrypted message, and I thought about the word performance, and I understood something that I had been circling for 290 days without landing on. They had never intended to break through the door.
The door was not the point.
The door was where the Council was looking.
They had built a window.
Cycle 2.3.308, day 308, 18 days later, at a moment synchronized to the relay clock's precision down to the second, across 11 locations simultaneously, the humans activated the gates. I was watching the boundary line when it happened.
The boundary line did not register any stress. The dampening net did not flag a breach. The containment perimeter showed nominal. Intact.
The locked door locked. And then the long-range array screened.
Not from the Sol system's direction. From behind me.
I spun the array 180 degrees and the display filled with contacts.
Hundreds of them. Small, unidentified, using a drive signature that didn't match any entry in the Council's vessel database.
They hadn't crossed the boundary line. They had exited from somewhere else entirely. I sat in my chair in the ozone-scented monitoring station at 9 in the morning on what I had taken to calling a Tuesday, and I looked at the display, and I heard myself say, very quietly, to no one, "Oh." They were never trying to leave. I logged the timestamp.
I reached for the emergency escalation channel. My coffee sat cooling beside me at its impossible angle. I did not drink it.
For the first time in 308 days, I had something more important to do.
There is a protocol for first contact with a newly emergent civilization.
I know this because I read the Council's full procedural documentation during my transit to the posting, the way you read emergency exit instructions on a shuttle, comprehensively, believing you will never need them.
The protocol is 47 pages long.
It includes provisions for hostile emergence, peaceful emergence, ambiguous emergence, partial emergence, and what the documentation calls guided emergence, which is the polite term for situations where the Council has been involved in shaping a civilization's development and, therefore, bears some responsibility for whatever it developed into.
There is no protocol for they went sideways.
I want to be precise about what happened in the 14 minutes between my array alarm and my first successful transmission to Council Command, because the 14-minute gap is going to matter in whatever review comes later and I am going to be the one asked to account for it. Minute 1, I confirmed the contacts were real. Not a sensor ghost, not a net artifact, not equipment failure.
Real vessels. Hundreds of them. The number was still resolving as I ran the confirmation. Minute 2, I attempted to hail on the emergency channel.